Hello everyone, it's Hoplite Mike. I hope you're all doing well. Today we are back with Lord of the Rings Total War Remastered, which is a mod for Total War Rome Remastered. This video is a faction overview and guide for Gondor. I will run through the custom generals, how the economy and recruitment works, campaign strategy, and lastly a full showcase of the unit roster on the battlefield. As Gondor, you start with the biggest territory in terms of number of regions, and you also border both Mordor and Harad, making you the front line of men against the forces of evil. Strategically, the position isn't bad. You have a lot of natural protection afforded to you by the mountains in the north and the water in the south. There also isn't a big threat coming from the west, particularly at the start of the campaign, and this allows you to focus most of your resources on the east. The key challenge of Gondor is trying to strike a balance between the military and economy, as you try to field sufficient armies to deal with your surrounding enemies, while also earning enough money to fund the expensive Gondor troops. I'm going to start with generals and unique characters because that is an interesting part of any faction. As Gondor, you start with a lot of general units. You have 14 in total, which is almost a full stack, and that means you don't need to invest as much into your military units at the start of the game because of the power provided to you by those generals. We will begin in the north. The campaign starts when Lurtz ambushes the Fellowship at Amon Hen with his Uruk-hai, which is why Boromir, Legolas, Gimli, and Aragorn are all in this area. Lurtz is also here, but he is hidden, ready to ambush. Once you move, he will attack. I just want to take a moment to appreciate the different character models. There is a wide variety of models in this mod, and they've really done a fantastic job there. In terms of the custom General's Bodyguard, Aragorn has the Rangers of the North, Boromir the Rangers of Ithilien, and Legolas the Mirkwood Rangers. All three are hybrid melee and arch units, being strong in both departments. The arch units are particularly important as Gondor, as you need them to deal with the fell beasts of Mordor and the Mumakil of Harad before they reach the front line. Gimli is accompanied by the Old Guard, which is a very defensive axe unit. The thing to note is that even though you effectively have 4 generals here, they do have a lower number of men compared to the generic bodyguard units. They start with a unit size of 30, but once they start dying off in battle, they won't replenish above 16 per unit. This is just to act as a balance on their power, and realistically I would class these as 2 general units once you take this into account. To the west, you have Gandalf the White, which has the Grey Company cavalry unit. In terms of raw stats, these are the best cavalry in the game, but again they are balanced by the low unit size. Once you lose Gandalf in battle, you will also lose your Grey Company cavalry unit, and they won't come back, so be careful with them. You want to use them in battle, but don't lose them needlessly. Now we've covered the Fellowship, I'm going to move on to the other generals. Something I really like about Gondor is the fact they have generals with region-specific bodyguard units and models. So to start, I will show the generic model and bodyguard for a Gondor general. If we take Angbor here, we can see the generic model for a Gondor general, and the generic bodyguard unit being the Guards of the Citadel, which is effectively just a very good spear unit. However, if we go to our different regions, we will see different models and bodyguard units. So for example, Dol Amroth here in the south, you'll see that the model is slightly different. You also have Imrahil, who is in Dol Amroth itself, who has the same Dol Amroth model. So you have 2 Dol Amroth generals, and they both have the White Knight bodyguard unit, which are some of the strongest cavalry in the game. They are equivalent to the Knights of Dol Amroth that you can get from the highest tier of barracks in Dol Amroth. Likewise, if we go to Peneth Gelen, we've got another general in here with a different model and a region-specific bodyguard unit, the Green Hill Riders. This region is called the Anfalas. Again, if we go to Arnak, you've got Forlong, who again has a slightly different model for the region of Lossarnoch, and his bodyguard unit are the Lossarnoch Riders. Again, a decent cavalry unit, but nowhere near as good as the Dol Amroth Knights. Moving across the water, you've got the Ithilien regions. So Damrod, who starts here, as the Master Rangers bodyguard unit, which is similar to the Rangers of Ithilien. Very strong archer unit. And that concludes the region-specific bodyguards, but I do love the fact that you have different models for each region and different bodyguard units. It really increases the immersion into the game. It's a really nice touch. Beyond that, there are also some different models. If we take the faction leader, Denethor, he also has a model here. And his bodyguard unit is the Guards of the Steward. This cavalry unit is the same as the Knights of Gondor, except they have +2 hit points, which makes them a bit tougher to kill. But being a cavalry unit, it will be useful anyway. And then you have Faramir, who is defending Osgiliath, who also has a specific model. This bodyguard unit is the Master Rangers, which are akin to the Ithilien Rangers. Very accomplished archer units. And then last but not least, we have the King of the Dead, who starts here, stuck in the mountains. To release him, you need to send Aragorn to Eric for a couple of turns, and at that stage you'll get a prompt which will allow you to release the King of the Dead and send him off to Mordor. But the King of the Dead is an extremely powerful general unit. It's got 240 men in that unit, and they also have very good stats as well. They can basically take on full armies by themselves. So something to note about the generals are that even though you start with the region-specific generals and their associated bodyguard units, such as the Dol Amroth generals, once your region-specific generals die, they don't come back. So every general that spawns after the start of the game will be a Guards of the Citadel unit and have this model. So basically that just means that your cavalry general units are very precious, because once they die you can't get them back, and cavalry units are very useful, especially in the early game. So I would be careful if you're using your cavalry general units against Mordor. You want to use them because they are your most powerful general units, but you don't want to lose them needlessly. So that's just something to note there. Next, I will run through how the economy works. You start with a large number of settlements, and there's a lot of earning potential in your starting regions. The problems for economy generally come a bit later into the campaign. This is because the Mordor and Harad provinces you conquer don't bring in a lot of money due to the restrictions on economy buildings in those regions. So paying for the expensive Gondor units can put a strain on your economy. Therefore, I would prioritize spending on economy buildings in your starting regions. During the mid-game, it's generally your starting settlements that will be required to do the lion's share of funding your military. The income of each settlement primarily comes from farming, taxes, and trade. And your economy buildings as Gondor consist of the trader, ports, farms, and roads. To be able to build farms in a settlement and boost your farming income, that settlement needs to have hidden resource farm. Fortunately, a lot of Gondor's starting settlements do have this hidden resource, which means you can make a decent income in those settlements. This is a very important revenue stream, as you can make around 1k in farming income per turn per settlement once those farms have been built up. The farms do give a tax penalty, but I don't think you would ever avoid building them for this reason. And additionally, they do give population growth, which indirectly increases the overall tax income anyway, by boosting the population level. Gondor can only build the trade building line in settlements that have hidden resource men. For the most part, that is everywhere that is inhabited by men at the start of the campaign, including the men of Harad and the Easterlings. So settlements inhabited by elves, dwarves, orcs, and goblins at the start of the campaign won't have this hidden resource, and you won't be able to build a trader there as Gondor. However, there are some exceptions to this. For example, the Gondor regions in Ithilien don't have hidden resource men, even though they are inhabited by men at the start of the campaign. There is also a number of starting settlements on the coast and on the banks of the Anduin, which will allow you to build ports and increase your trade income. Lastly, you have roads, which provide a small increase to trade income, but the primary benefit of them is to allow armies to move further per turn. In order to build roads in a settlement, it must have hidden resource roads, so you can't build them everywhere. However, I would still construct these where you can. Roads are important when playing as Gondor, as your starting territory is so large, it can take a while for reinforcements to reach your front lines. At the start, the economic infrastructure is not that built up, but you can get this going fairly quickly. I think a good aim is to get at least tier 1 economy buildings in every settlement that you can get them. I would prioritise the ports as they generally give the biggest marginal increase in gold. There is a couple of your starting settlements where the port building tree is available but you don't have one built. So for example, in Minas Tirith, we don't start with a port, but once we construct one, it increases income by 730 gold per turn. Penrith Gelen is another settlement where you can also build a first tier port. After establishing the first tier of ports, I would generally either go for the farms or the traders. There is a few starting settlements with hidden resource farm that don't have the tier 1 farms at the start of the game, being Arnach, Pelagia and Linhir. So getting them will not only increase your farming income, but also increase population growth, which allows you to get to the higher tiers of economy buildings once the population hits the required threshold. The traders increase your trade income. I would recommend getting the first tier of these before you upgrade the ports, as they give a similar increase to gold for less than half the cost. As we discussed before, the regions you conquer generally aren't that profitable. Most of the Mordor regions don't have hidden resource farm, so you won't be able to build farms and bring in a decent farming income. This is the same for the Men of Harad provinces. Likewise, most of the Mordor and Harad provinces are not on the coast either, meaning you can't build ports to boost your trade income. Therefore, what happens when you go through the campaign generally is you start conquering the Mordor and Harad regions, which don't bring in much income, but you still need to be able to pay for the armies that take those settlements. So your military expenditure goes up fairly quickly, but your income doesn't increase at the same rate, which is why it's so important to keep investing in the economy of your starting regions. Now that we've covered the economy, I'm going to go into how recruiting works as Gondor. When it comes to recruiting units, there are 2 building types to be aware of. That's the barracks and the forge. Between these 2 buildings, they will give you access to the full Gondor roster of troops. The difference between the 2 is that the barracks gives you access to those region-specific fiefdom units, and the units you have access to will depend on the settlement that the barracks is built in. Whereas the forge gives you access to the same generic armoured Gondor units regardless of where it's built. I'll talk about the barracks in detail first. So as we discussed, the barracks gives you access to your fiefdom units. So for example, a barracks in Dol Amroth will give you access to Dol Amroth units, like the Knights of Dol Amroth and the Men-at-Arms of Dol Amroth, whereas the barracks in the region of Ithilien will give you access to Ithilien units, like the Rangers of Ithilien. Not every province or region will have fiefdom units. From looking at the game files, I believe there is 8 if you include Minas Tirith, which isn't really a fiefdom, but still you can get regional units from there. I'm just going to go through those 8 now. The first is the Anfalas region, which is basically just Penrith Gelen. The barracks in this settlement will give you access to the Anfalas units, the strongest of which are the Greenhill Riders and Greenhill Archers. The next region across is Dol Amroth, which we discussed. You can get your Dol Amroth spearmen, archers, swordsmen and knights from here. Then you've got the region of Lossark, which gives you access to the Lossark Axemen, Axe Guard, and Lossark Riders. The next one was Ithilien, that we've already covered. However, the region of Ithilien is actually 3 settlements. So you've got Kellingarth, Emin Arnon, and Penethanun. All 3 will give you access to the ranges of Ithilien from the tier 2 barracks. Then I also mentioned that Minas Tirith has some regional units. So if you go to the barracks in Minas Tirith, you'll see the guards of the tower from the tier 2 barracks. This is the only place you can get those. So we've covered 5 of the 8 regions, and all those 5 were in your starting territory. There are also some Conquerable regions that will give you access to Fiefdom troops, the first of which is Dale. If you capture a settlement that has hidden resource Dale, that will give you access to some Dale units. So I did use the shell to take control of Dale just for the purposes of this video and showing you the units that you can get. So if we go to the settlement and click on the barracks, we'll see the Dale Militia and the Ithilien Bowmen. Now, from looking at the game files, I think the regions that have hidden resource Dale are their 2 starting settlements, and then some other regions to the east, like Dorwinion. But neither of those units are very good, so it's probably not worth coming up here for them, and you've probably won the campaign by that point anyway. But moving on to the 7th region that you can get Fiefdom units from is Rohan. If you capture a settlement that has hidden resource Rohan, that will give you access to Rohan Fiefdom units. So again, I've used the shell to take control of Waldburg just for the purposes of this video. But if we go to the barracks here, you can see the Rohirrim Militia and the Rohirrim Bowmen. So any settlement that has hidden resource Rohan, where you build a barracks, you'll be able to get access to these troops. I think the settlements that have hidden resource Rohan are just their starting settlements, so any settlement in this area. The final region you can get Fiefdom units from is Bree. So from reading the game files, if you capture a settlement that has hidden resource Bree, that should give you access to the Bree Militia. Unfortunately, I'm not sure this one's working, but it is in the game files. So that covers the 8 regions that we discussed initially. Some other things to note about the barracks. If you build a barracks in a settlement that doesn't have any Fiefdom units, then it will generally only go up to tier 2, and you'll only be able to recruit the Gondor Guardsmen and the Yeoman Archers, which are here. That's the case for settlements like Linhir, Ethring, Coamble, and Erich. In settlements where you have the lesser horses resource, or the horses resource, which you can see on the map, so for example, Minas Tirith has the lesser horses resource and the horses resource. In those settlements, the barracks will go up to tier 3 and tier 4. So if you have the lesser horses resource, then the barracks will go up to tier 3, and you can get the Scouts of Gondor, which are quite a weak cavalry unit, but they only take 2 turns to recruit, so you do get some value from them. And then if you have the horses resource, you can get the tier 4 barracks, and that gives you access to the Knights of Gondor, which is some of the best cavalry you can get. I think it's the second best behind the Dol Amroth cavalry. So there's one last thing to note about the barracks, and to demonstrate this, I have taken control of one of Mordor's settlements. So in regions that don't have hidden resource men, you cannot build the forge beyond tier 1, and the tier 1 of the forge doesn't give you access to any units. However, in settlements that don't have hidden resource men, which this settlement doesn't, you can still build the barracks. So that is one of the sort of major advantages of the barracks building line, is that you can still get units from settlements that don't have hidden resource men, which is quite important because if you're conquering regions such as Mordor and you can't recruit any troops from the Forge, it would take a while for them to come, but because you've got access to the barracks, you can at least get something. So I think that's everything for the barracks. I'm now going to start talking about the Forge. So the Forge is basically the opposite of the barracks. That gives you generally the same units regardless of where it's built. So for example, a Forge in Pelagia gives you access to the men-at-arms, spearmen, archers, and winged swordsmen, and that's generally the case regardless of where it's built. So for example, Ethering's the same, so is Calamble, and so is Eric. There are some exceptions to that. So the Forge in Dol Amroth does not give you access to any Gondor units, and I think that's just because it's Dol Amroth, so they've got their own unit roster. The other thing to note is that the Forge in Minas Tirith operates slightly differently to all the other forges you can build. The Forge in Minas Tirith will give you early access to certain units. So for example, in Pelagia, or any other settlement for that matter, you need the Great Forge to get the Spearmen, and you need the Gondor Armory to get the Archers, so that's tier 2 to get the Spearmen and tier 3 to get the Archers, whereas the one in Minas Tirith gives you the Spearmen at tier 1 and the Archers at tier 2. So basically just gives you units earlier than you otherwise would have them. The tier 4 of the Forge in Minas Tirith is the only place that gives you access to the Guards of the Fountain, which are they're probably your strongest infantry unit, with a huge total defense and +3 hit points. And then the last thing to note about the Forge is just what we already discussed about not being able to build beyond tier 1 in settlements that don't have hidden resource men. So Minas Tirith obviously has hidden resource men because that is inhabited by men at the start of the campaign, so you can get the full building line of the Forge, whereas in a settlement like Mordor, or Mordor starting region, it'll only go to tier 1. Most regions that are inhabited by men at the start of the campaign have hidden resource men. The ones that don't have hidden resource men are generally those inhabited by the orcs, elves, goblins, dwarves. The men of Farad, they are men, so they still have hidden resource men. It's the same for the Easterlings. So it's not massively restrictive, but it's just something to bear in mind. If you're going after Mordor, you will not be able to recruit your best troops from this region. So I think that does it for the barracks and the Forge. The last thing I wanted to note in terms of how recruiting works, which is not directly related to recruiting, but it is still relevant for building units, is the upgrade buildings. So like with every faction, you have access to certain buildings that will allow you to increase your stats. So you've got the practice fields, which increases the heavy attack, the practice ranges, which increases the missile weapons, and the blacksmith for the armory. I think there's one more. Yeah, the light attack increases light weapons attack stat. So these are relevant because Gondor's units generally have quite low attack but good defense. So I would recommend building these practice fields somewhere to be able to upgrade that melee attack. And I would recommend you do it in a location that you're not dependent on for money, because it reduces the tax income bonus. So I would recommend building those in a settlement like Minas Morgul once you take it, or Nargroth, for example, because neither of these settlements really make much money. So you're not going to... The reduction in tax is not going to hurt you as much as if you built it in another region. So generally the way I play the game is that I'll have a recruiting centre, just generally Minas Tirith, because the Forge gives you access to, or early access to better units, and then once I've got units trained in Minas Tirith, I'll send them over to Minas Morgul for retraining, and that way you just preserve your income in Minas Tirith, and then you have your practice fields or whatever you've built to be able to increase the stats of your units without taking a hit on the tax income. Now we've run through how recruitment works, I just want to touch on recruiting strategy when playing as Gondor. I did recommend prioritising spending on the economy buildings, so there won't be much left for the military. Therefore, this strategy will focus on getting value for money. First, I'm going to discuss the infantry units. Your two starting settlements, Minas Tirith and Caer Andros, both have a tier 1 forge, which means you can recruit the men-at-arms of Gondor from that building. These are a great swordsman unit, not just in the early or mid-game, but right the way through to the end of the campaign. They've got excellent defense at 23, as do most of the armoured Gondor units. They have great morale at 24, and the melee attack of 4 is a bit on the low side, but this can be improved by building the practice fields and retraining, and also just through experience in battle. The reason I'm bringing them into the strategy is because you don't need to invest in any upgrades to military buildings to get them. Both Minas Tirith and Caer Andros start with a tier 1 forge, so you can just get these units straight away. Additionally, because you can use them until the end of the campaign, I think they're actually less expensive than the cost might suggest, because you don't need to invest in better units later on and incur another round of recruitment costs to replace. These won't become obsolete. Secondly, because you can use them until the end of the campaign, it means any experience built up is not lost. So as you use them in battle and earn that experience, the stats will increase, but the cost will stay the same. So you're getting better value for money as the campaign goes on. And because you don't need to upgrade to better units that would reset that experience, you'll see that value right until the end. In terms of other options for infantry units, the settlement of Arnak starts with a tier 1 barracks, which gives you access to the Axe Guards of Lossarnoch. The key point here is that they actually have quite similar stats to the men-at-arms of Gondor, but they are about half the cost, so these are definitely a good option in the early game. In terms of archer units, your starting settlements actually already have a lot of archer units in the starting garrison. So Minas Tirith has 2 units of archers here, Caer Andros has another 2 units, and Osgiliath has 2 units when you include Faramir, which is a Master Rangers unit. And then you've got the regions of Ithilien. Kellingarth has 1 unit of Ithilien Rangers, so does Emyn Arnon, and then you've got Damrod, who's a Master Rangers unit, and lastly Henethinin has 2 units of the Rangers of Ithilien. So because of this, you don't need to invest that heavily into archer units at the start of the campaign, but the options for recruiting archers are the following. So if you upgrade the Forge in Minas Tirith to tier 2, that will give you access to the archers of Gondor. These are a very expensive archer unit, and the missile attack doesn't justify the cost. Most of the money here is going on defense and morale, but they are there and accessible if you want to use them. The other options are in Penithgelen, if you get the tier 1 barracks, that will give you access to the Huntsmen of Umphalas, which are a early game archer unit. You'll see the stats don't look great, but they actually have similar missile attack to the Archers of Gondor, it's only 2 less, and they're about half the cost, and obviously that is reflected in the reduced defense, but in terms of archer performance, they are similar to the Archers of Gondor. The other options are the Blackroot archers, so in these regions here, there are Blackroot mercenaries available, so you actually start with 1 in Eric. Blackroot archers, so they actually have missile attack of 15, which is 3 more than the Archers of Gondor, so much better than them. But they do have quite low defense. The key point here is that the upkeep cost is actually quite cheap, and you don't need to invest in any military buildings to recruit them, you can just get them as mercenaries. So if I pull out a general here, hopefully they'll be in the recruitment pool, which they are. So unfortunately they cost 600 gold to recruit, but the upkeep per turn is not that high, and that's the key figure here because that's the amount of money we're paying every turn. So definitely get these if you can. They've got much better missile attack than the Archers of Gondor, slightly reduced range, but I think these are the best you can get in the early game. The best archers you can get are the Rangers of Ithilien, which come from the region of Ithilien. Unfortunately, you need a tier 2 barracks to be able to recruit them, and all of the settlements here are just town, just a tier 1 settlement. So what I usually do is just drop the tax rate in Hen Ithilien, which is the closest to that 2,000 threshold, and that will increase the population growth and allow you to get that to that threshold as quickly as possible and recruit the Rangers of Ithilien. So lastly, I'm going to cover cavalry. So your options for recruiting cavalry are either to upgrade the tier 2 barracks in Minas Tirith to tier 3, and that gives you access to the Scouts of Gondor. These are a very weak cavalry unit. If you upgrade to tier 4 in Minas Tirith, that will give you access to the Knights of Gondor, which are a solid cav unit but also quite expensive. In Arnak, if you get the tier 3 barracks, that will give you access to the Lost Armoured Riders. And in Ithilien, if you upgrade to the tier 3 barracks, you'll get the Green Hill Riders, which again are a good value cav unit. So I don't usually go for that just because getting to a tier 3 barracks in Ithilien will take a while and it's expensive. It's the same story for Arnak. Arnak only starts with a tier 1 barracks, so getting that to tier 3 will be expensive, and in Minas Tirith you need to upgrade to the tier 4 barracks to get decent cav. So usually in the early game I just rely on my generals to provide the cavalry support. So your starting general in Minas Tirith, who's Denethor, as the guards of the Steward cavalry bodyguard. These are similar to the Knights of Gondor but with plus 2 hit points. And then the starting general in Arnak also has Lost Armoured Riders. So both of these generals are quite close to Mordor, so you can just bring them in to act as your cavalry support. And that's what I would do in the early game. Now that we have covered the generals, economy and recruitment, I want to discuss the overall campaign strategy. The victory objectives are to defeat Isengard, Mordor, the Men of Thrad and the Easterlings. Out of those 4, Mordor is obviously the most pressing issue and the one we want to deal with first. I would take nearly all of your forces around Osgiliath. Between the settlements of Minas Tirith, Caer Andros, Osgiliath and Emin Arnon, you will find a near full stack. Then with this force, go straight to Minas Morgul. You should be able to get there in 2 or 3 turns with a fairly large army. Make sure you have a decent number of archers in this army to be able to deal with the Fell Beast. You need to be able to take them out before they get to your front line. Remember that both Faramir and Damrod are archer units, so make sure to bring them in. At the same time, make sure to include Denethor, the faction leader, and Forlong, the general who starts in Arnak, as these are some of your only cavalry units that can get close to Minas Morgul in the first few turns. In the meantime, send a small detachment north to attack from the other entrance. Once you have taken these 2 settlements, this will contain Mordor, as the only way out will be these 2 choke points. If you don't take Minas Morgul early, Mordor will stream out of here and start attacking settlements all over the place. Once you have done that, you can relax for a couple of turns and wait for reinforcements. In terms of proceeding after this, remember when fighting Mordor that once Sauron is defeated, Mordor is destroyed as a faction, regardless of how many regions they have left. So I would recommend not getting involved in unnecessary battles. I would generally just go straight for their capital, where Sauron usually resides, which is Barad-dûr. Note that Mordor can replenish armies much faster than you can, as their units take 1 turn to recruit, whereas most of yours take at least 2. In addition to that, it will take a while for reinforcements to reach you from Minas Tirith, so try to be as efficient as possible. Take advantage of your archers and try to minimize losses. It's likely you'll have at least 1 big battle along the way. After you've dealt with Mordor, you'll probably need to deal with the Men of Thrad. Sometimes they attack early on in the south, but if you're able to bring in some of the units from the west, like in Dol Amroth and Ithilien, this should be enough to hold them off until you've dealt with Mordor. A strategy for going after the Men of Thrad is to send 2 forces, a boat south to Umbar from Dol Amroth and another force south of Ithilien. Like with Mordor, archer units are very important against Thrad because they have Mummikill. You will need to be able to take them out with archer fire before they reach the front line and start running through your infantry. Don't send cavalry to deal with Mummikill as they get a -5 combat modifier. Something else to note is their navy is generally stronger than yours. They start with a number of fleets, whereas Gondor only starts with 1 fleet with 1 unit aboard. However, your boats are inherently stronger than theirs, so if you're attempting sea battles, make sure you just have a comparable number of units. Something to note when fighting against the Men of Thrad is that some of their generals are Mummikill units, but it won't show you this on the battle screen. You'll just see the picture of the general. To be able to see that, you need to click on the general's bodyguard icon. You'll need to look at that before you go to the battle screen. This will just make a difference in terms of the troops that you need to bring to that battle. After Harad, it's likely you will be fighting against the Ithiliens. The thing to watch out for with them is that they do have chariots. The best counter to chariots is pikemen, but unfortunately Gondor don't have any pikes. So in the absence of that, the best unit you have is spearmen, although you can use archers to take them out. As you start taking settlements off Mordor and the men of Harad, remember to remove the different culture buildings, as a lot of them will provide no benefits and only negative effects. Now I'm going to do a showcase of all the different units that Gondor can recruit. So as we discussed in the recruiting section, Gondor has two types of units. The Fiefdom units that are region specific and can only be recruited from the barracks in certain settlements. And then you have the overarching generic Gondor units which can be recruited from the Forge. I just want to reiterate, the Forge can only be built beyond tier 1 in settlements that have hidden resource men, which is generally any settlement that is inhabited by men at the start of the campaign, with a few minor exceptions. So for example, most of Mordor's starting settlements do not have hidden resource men, so you won't be able to build your Forge beyond tier 1 in those settlements. If a settlement does not have this hidden resource, that means you can only build tier 1 of the Forge and it won't give access to any units. This is not the same for the barracks. You can still build and recruit units from the barracks in a settlement that does not have hidden resource men. However, there is only a limited selection of troops you can obtain from there. I'm going to start with Gondor's mainline units that can be recruited from the Forge, because I will be using these as a reference point when looking at the regional units. With a few exceptions, Gondor is generally characterized by having expensive units that have high defense and morale, but mediocre attack. The standard Gondor swordsmen, archers and spears all take 2 turns to recruit, so this is the threshold. If a unit takes more than 2 turns to recruit, then the stats have to make this worth it. We will start with the men-at-arms of Gondor. These are one of my favourite units in the campaign, because you can recruit these from a tier 1 forge, which both Minas Tirith and Caer Andor start with, so you can get access to these straight away. They have very high defense and morale, a decent unit size, and are more than capable against neighbours Mordor and Harad. They are actually strong enough that you can use them for most of the campaign, which means any experience you get in them is not wasted because you don't need to upgrade to better units later on. The negatives are that they do have fairly low attack, but this can be increased by building the practice fields that increases heavy attack, and also through building up experience from battles. Another negative is that they are quite expensive. They cost 510 gold to recruit and have a 260 upkeep cost per turn. However, as you can use them as the backbone for your armies for most of the campaign, I would say that investment is well worth it. Next, I will move on to the Spearmen of Gondor. These are recruitable from the tier 1 forge in Minas Tirith and the tier 2 forge in every other settlement. They are similar to the men-at-arms of Gondor in that they have high defense and morale but low attack. Again, they are quite expensive at 490 gold to recruit and 250 upkeep per turn. I haven't found the spearmen to be that useful in campaigns, as the enemies you'll be fighting against don't have much in the way of cavalry, and the generic Gondor general is actually a spear unit, so you can use those generals to fill that role if you need them. Spears can be useful against the Fell Beast and Trolls of Mordor, as well as the Murmikil of Harad. However, I find archers a better way to deal with those units. However, the spears do have some use against the chariots of the Easterlings, as Gondor does not have any pike units. Next, we move on to the archers of Gondor. These are recruitable from the tier 2 forge in Minas Tirith and the tier 3 forge everywhere else. These archers follow the general theme that we have seen so far. They have a low missile attack but decent defense for an archer unit and also good morale. They are very expensive at 710 gold to recruit and 350 upkeep per turn. However, you do need them in the early game to deal with the Fell Beast and Trolls of Mordor and also the Murmikil of Harad. Despite their high cost, the main advantage they have over the better archers you have access to is they take 2 turns to recruit instead of 3. They are, however, completely outclassed by the Rangers of Ithilien, which have higher missile attack and range, allowing you to deal with those Murmikil from further out before they reach the front line. Next we have the Winged Swordsman, recruitable from the tier 3 forge in Minas Tirith, and the tier 4 forge in every other settlement. These are an outlier compared to the units we have seen so far, as they are more offensively based. They have double the attack of the men-at-arms of Gondor, but lower defense at 18 and also a slightly reduced unit size. Their main selling point is that they have armor penetration, which makes them useful against factions that have high armor. That won't be very useful against Mordor or Harad, as they don't have high armor values, but it will be useful against the Eastlings and Isengard in particular, as the Uruk-hai tend to be on the higher end for armor status. They are expensive at 620 gold and 310 upkeep per turn, and they do take 3 turns to recruit. However, they are very powerful, and I would recommend having a couple of units in your mid-game armies. Just bear in mind, their reduced defense means they won't hold the line as well as some of your other units. Then we move on to the iconic Guards of the Fountain, only recruitable from the tier 4 forge in Minas Tirith. If we thought the first 3 units had high defense and low attack, then this unit is the embodiment of that. A huge 28 defense and plus 3 hit points, these will not go down without a fight. These units cost a massive 1,270 gold and have an upkeep of 640 gold per turn. They also take 4 turns to recruit, so when you consider that you need a tier 4 forge and they also take 4 turns to recruit, it can take a long time to get them. Given the prohibitive cost and the length of time to recruit, I don't think these are meant to be recruited in large numbers. I would add 1 or 2 units to a late game army to act as a stone wall in your front line. Lastly, we have the Knights of Gondor, which is your primary cavalry unit. These are actually recruitable from tier 4 of the barracks in settlements that have the horse resource, rather than the forge, but I'm still calling them mainline units because they fit in with the others. They're just a very solid cav unit. The defense and attack is in line with other elite tier cav. The charge stat of 3 is also standard. Like with most units here, they are expensive at 900 gold and 450 upkeep per turn, and they take 3 turns to recruit. In my campaigns, I prefer to use generals to provide the cavalry support, and just use the money I would have spent on these units and the tier 4 barracks elsewhere. Now that I've covered those generic Gondor units, I will move on to the Fiefdom units. Once again, these are the regional units that can only be obtained from the barracks in specific regions. So for example, the Dol Amroth units here can only be recruited from a barracks in Dol Amroth, whereas the Lossarnog units here can only be obtained from a barracks in Lossarnog. The Fiefdom units are a bit of a mixed bag. Some are designed to be cheap early game units that can do a job until you get the stronger Gondor troops, and others like the Dol Amroth units are some of the strongest in the game. Each group here represents units from a different region. We will start with the units from the settlement of Arnach in the region of Lossarnog, which sits just west of Minas Tirith. There are 3 regional units you can obtain from a barracks in Arnach. Firstly, we have the Lossarnog Axe Guards that you can get from the tier 1 barracks. I would call these fairly weak early game units. Their main selling point is that they are cheap, only 250 gold to recruit and 130 per turn upkeep, which is about half that of the men-at-arms of Gondor. Their melee attack of 5 is actually pretty good, but their defense is average and they will get overpowered fairly easily. I would generally only recruit these if you need a cheap way to build up some armies. Moving on to the Axemen of Lossarnog that you can get from the tier 2 barracks. These are in some ways similar to the Axe Guards. They cost the same but have 1 more attack and 5 less defense by virtue of losing their shields. In my opinion, giving up 5 defense isn't worth it for plus 1 attack, so I'd generally just go for the Axe Guards, unless you are using them to flank, in which case the defense is less important. Lastly, we have the Lossarnog Riders from the tier 3 barracks. These are a solid cavalry unit at a cost of 530 gold and 270 upkeep per turn. The main advantage of these units is they are much better value than the Knights of Gondor. They are about half the cost, have very similar, albeit reduced stats, and can be obtained from a tier 3 barracks as opposed to tier 4. They also have a higher unit size to make up for the slightly reduced defense, attack, and charge stats. Moving on to the Anfalas region, there are 4 Fiefdom units that can be obtained from the barracks in Ithilien, which sits in the Anfalas region. This is the furthest west of your starting provinces. Ithilien is isolated, so it's actually quite likely you'll be forced to use some of the region-specific units here, because reinforcements coming from your eastern settlements will take a long time to get there. Firstly, we've got the Herdsmen that you can get from the tier 1 barracks. These are very weak units, not much better than peasants, so there's not much to say on them. I wouldn't recruit these unless you had no other option. Next we have the Huntsmen of the Enthalers that are an early game archer unit, also recruitable from the tier 1 barracks. They aren't terrible at the start of the campaign, but both the missile attack and range are low at 10 and 130 respectively. Decent archer units generally have a range of between 160 and 170. Their low defense also means that if they get caught in combat, they have no chance at all. Their main selling point is that they are archers you can get from a tier 1 building, and they are actually half the cost of the Archers of Gondor while having a comparable missile attack and range. I actually would recommend recruiting these at the start just because they do present much better value than the Archers of Gondor. Then you have the Green Hill Archers. They are obtainable from the tier 2 barracks and are a slight upgrade on the Huntsman. They have a similar cost but upgraded stats in terms of missile attack and defense. They do still have the problem of low range of 130 and they take 3 turns to recruit, which isn't great either. I would probably go for the Huntsman before I went for the Green Hill Archers, as they take 1 less turn to recruit and the stats aren't that much worse. Lastly we have the Green Hill Riders. These are very similar to the Lossarnock Riders in stats and cost. They are also obtainable from a tier 3 barracks with a 3 turn recruitment length. As before, I believe these to be a better value than the Knights of Gondor. Next we have the best archers that Gondor has available, the Rangers of Ithilien. There are 3 settlements within Ithilien that you can obtain these units from, and they all sit between Osgiliath and Mordor. You need the tier 2 barracks to recruit these, which requires a large town. Unfortunately, all 3 of those settlements are only tier 1, so it will take a bit of time to build them up and have access to these units. They are expensive as you might expect. They cost 580 gold and have a very high upkeep cost of 440 per turn. Their main selling point is the excellent range of 160 and high missile attack of 16, which outclasses all the other archers you have access to. Unfortunately, they also take 3 turns to recruit. However, I believe in this case the stats are well worth it. They are very useful for fighting the men of Harad, as they have Mummikill, and you're going to need archers with good range to deal with them from as far out as possible. Then we move on to the Dol Amroth units, which are the jewel in the crown for the Gondor roster. Firstly, we have the Guardsmen of Dol Amroth, recruitable from the tier 1 barracks. This is a strong spear unit with a fairly cheap recruitment cost of 340 gold and 170 upkeep. They have very similar stats to the Gondor spear units, but are noticeably cheaper, so I would recruit these over the Gondor Spearmen. The problem is you can only get them from 1 settlement, so it's difficult to recruit a lot of them. Then we have the Dol Amroth Archers from the tier 2 barracks. Unfortunately, these are significantly worse than the Archers of Gondor. They take 1 more turn to recruit, have 5 less defense, and have the same terrible melee attack stat of 2. They are significantly cheaper than the Archers of Gondor, but the 3 turns to recruit just isn't worth it. I would probably get the Huntsmen of the Enthalers over these, given they are cheaper, take 1 less turn to recruit, and only have 2 less missile attack. Moving on to the Men-at-Arms of Dol Amroth, which are a very solid unit. They take 3 turns to recruit, and you can only get them from the tier 3 barracks. This does present some disadvantages when comparing them to the Men-at-Arms of Gondor, as that unit only takes 2 turns to recruit and they are available from a tier 1 building. However, the Dol Amroth Men-at-Arms do have an improved melee attack of 6 compared to 4, solid defense and higher morale. They are also slightly cheaper at 450 recruitment cost and 220 upkeep per turn. Overall, they are a very good all-round unit. In terms of raw stats, they are definitely better than Gondor's swordsman units. Last but not least, we have the Knights of Dol Amroth, which are an incredibly strong cavalry unit. There are some cav units that have better stats, but everything it does has a much lower unit size of around the 30s. So the fact this has a unit size of 72 might make it the best cavalry unit in the game. It is strictly better than the Gondor cav unit, having better attack, defense and morale. Unfortunately, it does take 4 turns to recruit, which is 1 more than the Gondor Knights. They are also expensive, as you might expect, at 870 gold to recruit and 430 upkeep per turn. However, they are the best recruitable cavalry that Gondor has access to. So there are some other fiefdom units, but I wasn't going to go through them in detail because they come from regions you have to conquer rather than start with, and none of them are strong enough that you would go out your way to get them. If you capture a settlement that has hidden resource Dale, which is basically just one of their starting settlements and some others in the area to the southeast of Dale, you will be able to recruit the Dale militia and Dalian bowmen from a barracks that you build in that settlement. However, Dale is on the other side of the map to Gondor, so if you've taken that settlement, you've probably won the campaign at that point anyway. Additionally, the units aren't strong enough that you go out your way to get them either. If you take a settlement that has hidden resource Rohan, which is basically just any of Rohan's starting provinces, then you can recruit the Rohirrim militia and Rohirrim bowmen from a barracks in that settlement. However, both units are very weak, and it's unlikely you would attack Rohan for the purpose of getting these units. Lastly, we have the Bree militia that you can recruit in Bree from a barracks. Like with Dale, Bree is a long way from Gondor, so it's unlikely you would have got there without winning the campaign first. The units themselves are not great either. Then we finally have another small group of units to go through. These are all recruitable from the barracks. I did say the main purpose of the barracks was to recruit region-specific units, but there are some units you can get from the barracks regardless of where it is. That's the Gondor Guardsmen and the Gondorian Yeoman Archers. The Gondor Guardsmen are obtainable from a Tier 1 barracks. They are a weak spear unit overall with a melee attack stat of 2. The only redeeming features of this unit is the large unit size of 160 and cheap upkeep cost of 150 per turn. The main selling point of this unit are that it functions as the only melee infantry unit available from a settlement that doesn't have hidden resource men. So for example, most of the Mordor settlements don't have hidden resource men, so you can't recruit units from the Forge or build this beyond Tier 1. However, you can build the barracks in those settlements and recruit this Gondor Guardsman unit. However, I wouldn't use it unless you had nothing else. It does also take 3 turns to recruit. Next we have the Gondorian Yeoman Archers available from Tier 2 of the barracks, but Tier 1 in Minas Tirith. This is a fairly weak arch unit that isn't dissimilar to the Huntsman unit we discussed earlier from the Anfalas region. The main issue is that it takes 3 turns to recruit, which is too long. However, as with the Guardsman, it is the only arch unit you can recruit from a settlement that doesn't have hidden resource men. Next we have the Guards of the Tower, only obtainable from the Tier 2 barracks in Minas Tirith. Their stats are similar to the Men-at-Arms of Gondor, but they have a lower unit size, lower defense, and take an extra turn to recruit. Having one in your armies can be useful due to the Eagle mechanic, but again the stats don't justify the 3-turn recruitment. Lastly, we have the Scouts of Gondor that you can get from the Tier 3 barracks in any settlement that has the lesser horses resource. They are basically a weak early game cavalry unit. They act as a way to get early cavalry, as Minas Tirith has the lesser horse resource and already starts with a Tier 2 barracks, so you only need to upgrade this once to be able to recruit this unit. However, the stats are very poor. A melee attack of 4 combined with a charge stat of 1 isn't going to do much damage. Their redeeming feature is that they only take 2 turns to recruit, whereas all the other cavalry in the roster takes at least 3 turns. The last section is on the different generals' bodyguard units. I don't think we need to go through them in detail because we all know that bodyguards are very powerful. The only thing I would note is the Gondor generic general is the Guards of the Citadel unit. All generals that spawn in after the start of the campaign will be this Guards of the Citadel unit. So for any generals that start with different bodyguards, that unit will be lost if that general dies. Therefore be careful with your cavalry and archer generals, because once they are gone, they won't come back. The Guards of the Steward are Denethor's bodyguard. They have identical stats to the Knights of Gondor that we already covered. They just have +2 hit points, which makes them harder to kill. The White Knights are the bodyguards for the Dol Amroth generals, of which we have 2 at the start of the game. These have identical stats to the Knights of Dol Amroth that we already covered, but again have +2 hit points. The Master Rangers are the bodyguards for starting generals Faramir and Damrod. They closely resemble the Rangers of Ithilien with slightly higher missile attack and defense. Arch units are very important when playing as Gondor for taking out the Mumakil of Harad and Fell Beasts of Mordor, so keep these units safe if you can. The starting general in Lossark, being Forlong, has the Lossark Riders as their bodyguard unit, and the starting general in the Anfalas, being Hurlebeen, has the Greenhill Riders as their bodyguard unit. Both units were already covered in the Fiefdom section. Next we have the generic Gondor bodyguard, the Guards of the Citadel, which are a spear unit with decent attack. It's not a bad generic general unit by any means, but cavalry would be better. Lastly, we have the Army of the Dead, a general unit with a huge unit size of 240 and a massive charge stat of 10. They are effectively edited cavalry with a ghost invisible mount, and they go berserk as soon as they enter combat. Their melee attack and defense don't look great, but they are one of the strongest units in the game. They can basically take out whole armies by themselves. Just don't leave them to defend a settlement by themselves, as they will go berserk, leave the victory square, and then the enemy can just take it and your unit is automatically wiped out. That's going to be it for this one today. I hope you enjoyed the overview and guide for Gondor. If you're enjoying the content, please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.